The heavy oak doors of Courtroom 4B in the Springfield County Courthouse creaked open on that cold February morning, and every head turned toward the sound. What walked through those doors wasn't a typical witness. It was a tiny figure barely 3 feet tall, with curly brown hair tied up in pigtails with sparkly pink ribbons. Emma was wearing her favorite dress, the one with butterflies on it that her mother had bought her for her 3rd birthday just 4 months earlier. Her pink light-up sneakers squeaked against the polished marble floor with each hesitant step, the sound echoing through the cavernous room like a countdown to something everyone feared was impossible. District Attorney Sarah walked beside the little girl, her hand gently resting on Emma's small shoulder, guiding her forward. Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she was certain everyone in the courtroom could hear it. She had been a prosecutor for 11 years, had put away murderers, drug dealers, and white-collar criminals who'd stolen millions. But never, not once, had she felt this level of pressure. This case wasn't just about justice. It was about protecting a child who had already been through hell and asking her to relive it in front of 50 strangers. Emma clutched a worn teddy bear to her chest, a brown fuzzy thing with one eye missing and stuffing coming out of one paw. Her mother had told Sarah that Emma refused to go anywhere without Mr. Buttons, especially since the night everything changed. The night her uncle had turned their small apartment into a war zone. The night Emma's childhood innocence was shattered along with her mother's ribs, her sense of safety, and her understanding that the world was a safe place. Judge Robert Harrison sat on the bench, his weathered hands resting on the dark wood surface, knuckles white from gripping too hard. At 63 years old, he had presided over thousands of cases, seen every kind of crime imaginable, heard testimony from victims both eloquent and broken. But looking down at this child, this baby, really, his composure wavered. He was a grandfather himself. His own granddaughter was 4 years old, just a year older than Emma. The thought of little in this position made his stomach turn. Courtroom itself seemed to hold its breath. Journalists sat with pens frozen above notepads. The 12 jurors, 7 women and 5 men, leaned forward in their seats, their faces etched with concern and curiosity. How could a 3-year-old possibly testify? What could she even understand about the oath to tell the truth? In the back row of the gallery, court watchers and law students who made it a habit to observe interesting trials whispered among themselves. This was unprecedented, extraordinary, potentially groundbreaking, or potentially disastrous. But no one was more focused, more desperate for this moment than Maria. She sat in the 3rd row of the gallery, flanked by her sister on one side and a victim's advocate on the other. Maria's left arm was still in a sling from the fracture that hadn't quite healed. Her face bore the fatting yellow-green marks of bruises that had been deep purple just weeks ago. But the physical wounds were nothing compared to what she felt watching her baby daughter walk toward that witness stand. Maria's heart was simultaneously breaking and hopping. Breaking because Emma shouldn't have to do this. Hopping because Emma was the only person who could put away. Sat at the defense table in a press suit that his attorney had insisted he wear, looking nothing like the monster who had beaten his sister within an inch of her life over a few $100s he claimed she owed him. He was clean-shaven, hair neatly combed, playing the part of a respectable citizen. His attorney, a skilled defense lawyer known for getting guilty clients acquitted, wore a subtle smile. Had already told that morning over coffee that this case was as good as won. A 3-year-old witness. It was almost insulting that the prosecution was even trying. Children that young were notoriously unreliable, couldn't distinguish fantasy from reality, couldn't handle cross-examination. This would be dismissed before lunch. Sarah had spent 3 sleepless weeks preparing for this moment. She had consulted with 4 different child psychologists, read every case study about child witnesses under the age of 5, and even traveled to Boston to meet with a professor who specialized in forensic interviews with young children. Everyone had told her the same thing. This was a long shot. 3-year-olds typically don't have the verbal skills, the memory retention, or the emotional capacity to testify in court. Their understanding of time is limited. Their vocabulary is basic. They're easily confused, easily led, easily frightened. But Sarah had no choice. Emma was the only eyewitness. Without her testimony, without some way to communicate what she had seen, would walk free. And everyone in that courtroom knew what happened to witnesses after defendants walked free. As Emma reached the witness stand area, a small stepping stool had been placed so she could climb up to the seat. The witness chair, designed for adults, seemed to swallow her tiny frame. Her legs stuck straight out, unable to reach the ground. She looked even smaller than she had walking in, dwarfed by the massive wooden structure around her. Her big brown eyes, still carrying dark circles underneath from the nightmares that woke her up screaming every night, scanned the room slowly. She looked at the judge in his black robe towering above her. She looked at the jury box filled with serious adult faces. She looked at the stenographer with her strange clicking machine. She looked at the court officers standing by the doors in their uniforms. And then her eyes found her mother. Maria was crying silently, tears streaming down her face, her good hand pressed against her mouth to keep from sobbing out loud. Emma's lower lip began to tremble. She pulled Mr. Buttons closer to her chest, burying her face in the fuzzy brown fur. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, the sound reverberating through the silent courtroom. "Ms.," he said, his voice gentler than anyone had ever heard it, "you may proceed." Sarah approached the witness stand with a warm smile that didn't quite reach her worried eyes. She knelt down so she was at Emma's eye level, trying to make this less intimidating. "Hi, Emma," she said softly. "Do you remember me? We met last week and talked about your favorite cartoons." Emma stared at her unblinking, no response, not even a nod. Sarah's smile wavered but held. "Emma, can you tell everyone your name? Can you say your name for us?" Silence, complete, devastating silence. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. Someone in the gallery coughed. A juror shifted in their seat with a creak, but from Emma, nothing. Her eyes were open, she was breathing, but it was as if she had left her body entirely. She was somewhere else, somewhere far away where courtrooms and questions and scary men in suits couldn't reach her. Sarah tried again, her voice still patient, still kind. "Sweetie, can you point to your mommy? Can you show me where your mommy is sitting?" Emma's eyes flickered toward the gallery, toward her mother, but she didn't raise her hand, didn't move, just stared with those haunted eyes that had seen far too much for someone who should still believe in fairy tales and magic. This was going to be even harder than anyone had imagined. The weight of justice itself seemed to press down on that courtroom, on that tiny child who held the power to free or condemn in her small, trembling hands, if only she could find her voice. But that voice remained locked away, trapped behind walls of trauma and terror that no amount of gentle questioning could breach. At least, not yet. Not without help from the most unexpected source that was, at that very moment, walking through the courthouse doors on 4 legs. Officer Jake pushed open the heavy courtroom door as quietly as possible, wincing slightly as the hinges creaked despite his careful effort. At his side, connected by a standard-issue leather leash, walked Rex, 75 pounds of pure German Shepherd excellence, his black and tan coat gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Rex's ears swiveled forward, immediately assessing the new environment with the practiced awareness of a 5-year police veteran. His dark, intelligent eyes scanned the rows of wooden benches, the raised judge's bench, and the various people scattered throughout the room. Hadn't planned on sitting in on a custody hearing. He and Rex had just finished testifying in courtroom 3B, a straightforward drug possession case where Rex's keen nose had located 3 kilos of cocaine hidden in a car's door panel. The defense attorney had tried to challenge Rex's qualifications, but had calmly walked the jury through his partner's impressive resume. Dozens of successful narcotics finds, 3 missing children located, 2 drowning victims recovered, and a certification record that would make any K-9 handler proud. The case had wrapped up quickly after that, but now they were stuck waiting for the clerk to process their paperwork before they could head back to the precinct. Rather than standing awkwardly in the hallway, had slipped into the nearest courtroom to wait, choosing a seat in the back gallery where he and Rex would be unobtrusive. He'd learned years ago that courtrooms were surprisingly comfortable places to kill time, climate-controlled, with decent seating, and usually interesting enough to keep him from falling asleep on duty. Rex settled down beside's chair with the fluid grace of a working dog who'd done this 1,000 times before. His body language was relaxed but alert, his tail curled around his hindquarters, his breathing steady and controlled. To any casual observer, Rex appeared to be simply resting. But knew better. Rex was always working, always processing information through senses far superior to any humans. The dog could detect fear, aggression, stress hormones, and deception in ways that even the most experienced detective couldn't match. Absently scratched behind Rex's ears, a gesture of affection and partnership that had become automatic over their 5 years together. They'd been paired up when Rex was just 2 years old, fresh out of K-9 Academy and eager to prove himself. Then a 10-year veteran of the force had been skeptical at first. He'd never worked with a dog before and wasn't sure he wanted the responsibility, but Rex had won him over within days. The dog was smart, scary smart, and had an intuition about people that bordered on supernatural. As settled into his seat, his attention drifted to the custody case unfolding before him. A woman at the plaintiff's table was clearly struggling to hold herself together, her shoulders shaking with barely suppressed sobs. Her lawyer, an older gentleman who looked like he'd seen better days, was making valiant efforts to present a defense, but it seemed like an uphill battle. The opposing counsel, a sharp-dressed woman with silver hair, was methodically dismantling every argument with the precision of a surgeon. Had seen plenty of custody battles during his years on the force. They were always ugly, always painful, and rarely had clear-cut heroes or villains. Parents fought viciously over children, each convinced they were the righteous party, each certain that the other was unfit. Sometimes they were both right. Sometimes they were both wrong. Most of the time, the only real victim was the kid caught in the middle. His eyes found the little girl sitting in the back with a court guardian, maybe 3 or 4 years old, clutching a stuffed rabbit like it was a life preserver in a stormy sea. The child's face was flushed with anxiety, her small body rigid with tension. Felt a familiar pang in his chest. He had a daughter about that age at home, his pride and joy. He couldn't imagine putting her through something like this, couldn't fathom the kind of pain these parents were inflicting on their child by waging war in a courtroom. What noticed, and what made him pay closer attention, was Rex's reaction to the proceedings. His partner's ears had perked up in that particular way that meant something had caught his attention. Rex's gaze was fixed on the witness stand where a well-dressed man was preparing to testify. The dog's body had tensed ever so slightly, not aggressively, but with focused alertness. It was the same posture Rex took when he detected something off during a traffic stop, that sixth sense that told to be careful, to pay attention, to trust his partner's instincts. Frowned, studying the man on the witness stand more carefully. He looked like every other wealthy professional had encountered in courtrooms. Expensive suit, confident demeanor, perfectly styled hair. Nothing obviously wrong with him, but Rex didn't make mistakes. If the dog sensed something, there was something to sense. Over the years, had learned to read Rex's signals with near-perfect accuracy. A tilt of the head meant curiosity. A low whine meant eagerness to work. A stiffened stance and forward-pointing ears meant alert, something worth investigating. And right now, Rex was definitely on alert. The dog's nostrils flared slightly, processing the complex cocktail of scents in the courtroom: cologne, perfume, coffee, paper, wood polish, and beneath it all the chemical signatures of human emotion. Fear, anger, anxiety, stress. Rex could detect them all through the pheromones people unconsciously released. Had witnessed Rex's ability to read people in countless situations. There was the time they'd responded to a domestic disturbance call, and Rex had immediately positioned himself between and a seemingly calm man who'd exploded into violence 30 seconds later. Or the incident where Rex had refused to approach a smiling woman offering treats, sensing the aggression she'd hidden beneath a friendly facade. She'd later attacked another officer with a knife. Rex had saved life more than once simply by knowing things before did. Now, as the well-dressed man began his testimony, speaking in smooth, measured tones about how much he loved his daughter and how concerned he was about his ex-wife's instability, Rex's attention never wavered. The dog's eyes tracked every movement, every gesture. Noticed Rex's weight shift forward almost imperceptibly, a subtle change in posture that indicated heightened vigilance. "Your Honor, I love my daughter more than anything in this world," the man was saying, his voice catching with what appeared to be genuine emotion. "But I can't stand by and watch Sarah's instability put Emma at risk anymore." Rex's ears twitched. Felt it through the leash, a slight increase in tension, like a guitar string being tuned. Something about this guy was setting Rex off, and cop instincts were starting to tingle in response. He'd learned to trust that feeling, to trust Rex's judgment even when he couldn't articulate exactly what was wrong. Glanced at the little girl again and saw something that made his chest tighten. She was staring directly at Rex, not with the typical excitement that kids usually showed around police dogs, no squeals of delight or requests to pet him. Instead, her gaze was intense, almost desperate, like a drowning person spotting a lifeguard. Her eyes were locked on Rex with a focus that seemed far too mature for such a small child. There was something in that look, a plea, a hope, a connection that couldn't quite define but absolutely recognized. Rex, as if sensing the child's attention, turned his head slowly and met her gaze. For a long moment, the trained police dog and the frightened little girl simply looked at each other across the crowded courtroom. Felt the tension in Rex's body shift slightly, not relaxing exactly but changing quality. The dog's protective instincts had been triggered. Had seen it before when Rex worked with child victims, that innate gentleness that emerged despite all the aggressive training, that ability to recognize innocence and vulnerability. The little girl's grip on her stuffed rabbit loosened slightly. Her breathing seemed to slow. Even from across the room, could see some of the tension drain from her small shoulders. It was as if Rex's calm, steady presence had given her something to anchor herself to, some source of safety in a world that had become terrifying and incomprehensible. So attention snapped back to the witness stand as the man's testimony continued. He was describing incidents where his ex-wife had supposedly forgotten to pick up their daughter, moments when she'd been too emotional to handle basic parenting tasks. The words sounded rehearsed, carefully chosen, designed to paint a specific picture. Had interviewed enough suspects to recognize a prepared statement when he heard one. Rex shifted again, and this time felt the vibration of a barely audible growl in the dog's chest, so low that probably no one else in the courtroom noticed it. It wasn't an aggressive growl, not the warning sound Rex made when confronting a threat. It was something else, something had only heard a handful of times in their partnership. It was the sound Rex made when he detected deception, when something about a person's body language, scent, or behavior pattern triggered his deeply trained instincts that something was fundamentally wrong. Leaned down and whispered, "Easy, boy. What is it?" Rex's tail thumped once against the floor, acknowledgement but not relaxation. The dog's focus officer had been with the Springfield Police Department for 12 years, and in that time, he had seen just about everything a mid-sized American city could throw at a cop. Gang violence, drug busts, domestic disputes, armed robberies. He had responded to them all with the same calm professionalism that had earned him 3 commendations and the respect of every officer in his precinct. But it was his partnership with Justice, his German Shepherd K9 companion, that had become the defining feature of his career. Justice wasn't just a police dog, he was a legend in the department. At 5 years old, the German Shepherd had an impressive record, 43 successful suspect apprehensions, 17 drug seizures, and he had once tracked a missing child through 3 miles of dense forest in the middle of winter, finding the 6-year-old boy hypothermic but alive. Justice had that rare quality that all great K9 officers possessed, an almost supernatural intuition about people and situations. Had learned to trust that intuition completely. On this particular Tuesday morning, and Justice were scheduled for a routine security sweep of the Springfield County Courthouse. It was standard procedure, especially when high-profile cases were in session. The K-9 unit would walk through the building, check for any suspicious packages, ensure all security protocols were being followed. It was mundane work compared to their usual patrols, but necessary. Didn't mind. It gave Justice a break from the more intense aspects of police work. As guided his patrol car into the courthouse parking lot, Justice sat in the back seat, his ears perked up, his tail wagging with that boundless enthusiasm that never seemed to diminish no matter how many times they made this run. Smiled, looking at his partner in the mirror. "Ready for another boring morning, buddy?" he asked. Justice barked once, sharp and clear, his tongue lolling out in what had long ago decided was the dog's version of a grin. They entered through the secure side entrance, nodding to the officers manning the metal detectors. "Morning," said Officer Jennifer Price, a young cop who always kept treats in her pocket for Justice. "Big case going on in 4B today, some kind of child witness thing. Whole courthouse is talking about it." Raised an eyebrows. "Child witness, how young?" 3 years old from what I heard," Jennifer replied, shaking her head. "Can't imagine putting a baby through that. Word is it's not going well." Felt a familiar tightness in his chest. He was a father of 2 daughters, ages 7 and 9, and the thought of any child suffering made his protective instincts kick into overdrive. "That's rough," he muttered, giving Justice's leash a gentle tug. "Come on, boy, let's do our rounds." They started on the first floor, Justice's nose working overtime as they moved through the hallways. The dog was trained to detect explosives, narcotics, and weapons, and he approached every sweep with the same serious dedication. His claws clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floors. Click, 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 click. A sound that had become as familiar to courthouse staff as the sound of their own footsteps. As they made their way toward the second floor, noticed the tension in the building. Court staff huddled in small groups, speaking in hushed tones. A journalist practically ran past them, cell phone pressed to her ear, saying something about a heartbreaking scene and impossible testimony. The energy was different today, charged with something couldn't quite name. They reached the second floor and saw a small crowd gathered outside courtroom 4B. People were on a recess break, coffee cups in hand, but no one was chatting casually like they usually did. Instead, they stood in somber clusters, some wiping their eyes, others shaking their heads. A woman in a business suit leaned against the wall, openly crying into her hands. "What happened in there?" asked a bailiff he recognized. The bailiff, Tom, sighed heavily. "You don't want to know, 3-year-old girl, the only witness in a brutal domestic violence case. She can't speak, can't say a word. Been sitting in that witness box for 20 minutes like a little ghost. Most heartbreaking thing I've seen in 30 years on this job. Judge called a recess because the kid is too traumatized. Defense attorney is already preparing to get the case dismissed." Felt his jaw tighten. A 3-year-old witness, the only hope for justice in a domestic violence case, and she couldn't speak. He looked down at Justice, who was sitting calmly at his side, those intelligent amber eyes watching the crowd with interest. "Come on, buddy," said quietly. "Let's finish our sweep." They needed to check the courtroom itself, standard protocol during recess. Pushed through the heavy oak doors, Justice padding beside him, and immediately sensed the heaviness in the air. It was as if the room itself was mourning. The judge's bench stood empty. The jury box was vacant, but in the witness stand area he saw her. Emma sat in the oversized witness chair, her legs sticking straight out, a worn teddy bear clutched to her chest. A child services worker sat beside her, speaking softly, but the little girl wasn't responding. She was staring at nothing, her small face pale and expressionless, lost in whatever dark place her trauma had taken her. And then it happened. The moment Justice's claws clicked against the courtroom floor, click, 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 Emma's head snapped toward the sound. It was the first real movement had seen from her since entering the room. Her eyes, which had been glazed and distant, suddenly focused with laser-like intensity on Justice. stopped walking. He felt it, that electric moment when something significant was about to occur. Justice felt it too. The German shepherd's ears perked up fully, his posture straightening, his attention completely focused on the little girl. It was the same way Justice acted when he was about to make a find, that moment of absolute concentration before everything changed. Emma's grip on her teddy bear loosened slightly. She leaned forward in the chair, craning her neck to see Justice better. Her lips parted, and for the first time that morning, a sound escaped her throat. Not words, but a small, breathy gasp of recognition or interest or something couldn't quite identify. The child services worker noticed immediately. "Emma," she said softly, her voice filled with cautious hope. "Emma, do you see the doggy?" Sarah, who had been standing in the corner of the courtroom reviewing her notes and trying not to cry, looked up sharply. Her eyes went from Emma to Justice and back again. Her mind, trained to spot opportunities and angles in the courtroom, began racing. Emma was responding, not to questions, not to toys, not to comfort, but to the dog. Stood frozen, unsure whether he should stay or go. He didn't want to disrupt whatever was happening, but he also didn't want to leave if his presence, or more accurately, Justice's presence, was somehow helping this child. Emma slid down from the witness chair, her pink sneakers hitting the floor with a soft thump. The child services worker reached out to stop her, but Sarah held up a hand. "Wait," the prosecutor whispered. "Just wait." The little girl took 3 hesitant steps toward Justice, her teddy bear still clutched in one hand. She moved slowly, cautiously, like a wild animal approaching something it wasn't sure it could trust. Justice, to his eternal credit, remained perfectly still. The dog was trained for high-pressure situations, trained to remain calm when civilians approached, and his training held true now. Emma stopped about 5 feet away from Justice, her big brown eyes studying the German shepherd with an intensity that made his breath catch. And then, for the first time since entering that courtroom, since the entire nightmare of this day had begun, Emma smiled. It was a small smile, barely there, but it was real. It was life returning to a child who had seemed more ghost than girl just moments before. "Can she pet him?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might break the spell. Looked down at Justice, who was sitting calmly, his tail giving one slow, gentle wag. "Yeah," said softly. "Justice is gentle, he's good with kids." Sarah knelt beside Emma. "Would you like to pet the nice doggy, Emma? His name is Justice." Emma looked at Sarah, then back at Justice. And then, miracle of miracles, she nodded. It was a small movement, barely perceptible, but it was a response. The first response she had given to any question all morning. As Emma reached out her small hand and gently touched Justice's soft fur, running her fingers through the thick coat on the dog's head, something shifted in that courtroom. The air itself seemed to change. Felt goosebumps rise on his arms. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. The child services worker pressed her hand to her mouth, afraid to believe what she was seeing. Outside in the hallway, someone must have noticed what was happening, because suddenly people were crowding at the doorway. Judge Harrison, returning from his chambers, stopped in his tracks. Maria, Emma's mother, pushed through the crowd, her good hand flying to her mouth when she saw her daughter standing, moving, engaging with the world again. Emma continued to pet Justice, her small hand moving gently over the dog's head, down his neck, across his back. And Justice sat there like a statue of patience, barely moving, seeming to understand that this moment was important, that this little girl needed him to be exactly what he was, steady, calm, and safe. Sarah's mind was racing. An idea was forming, something unprecedented, something crazy, something that might just save this entire case. She looked at Officer, then at Justice, then back at Emma, who was now kneeling beside the dog, whispering something too quiet for anyone else to hear. What if, Sarah thought, her heart pounding with possibility, what if Justice could stay? Sarah had built her entire career on following the rules. 12 years of law school, bar exams, Courtroom procedures and precedents had taught her that the legal system functioned on order, protocol, and established guidelines. She had never colored outside the lines, never taken shortcuts, never done anything that could jeopardize a case. But as she watched 3-year-old Emma kneel beside Justice, the German Shepherd police dog, actually engaging with the world for the first time that morning, Sarah realized she was about to throw the entire rule book out the window. Her hands were shaking as she approached Judge Harrison, who had returned to the courtroom, and was watching the scene unfold with an expression somewhere between astonishment and confusion. The judge stood near his bench, his black robe making him look even more imposing than usual, but his eyes were soft as he watched Emma gently stroke Justice's fur. "Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice low and urgent, "I need to make a highly unconventional request." Judge Harrison turned to her, one eyebrow raised. At 63, Robert Harrison had thought he'd seen every courtroom tactic, every legal maneuver, every creative argument an attorney could make. "Ms., I'm not sure anything about today could be more unconventional than what we've already witnessed." Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Your Honor, I'd like to request that Officer's K-9 partner, Justice, be allowed to remain in the courtroom during Emma's testimony. I believe the dog's presence may help the child feel safe enough to communicate." For a moment, Judge Harrison just stared at her. Then he glanced at Emma, still kneeling beside the large German Shepherd, then back at Sarah. "You want to put a police dog in my courtroom during witness testimony?" "Yes, Your Honor." "A 70-pound German Shepherd?" "Yes, Your Honor." "During a criminal trial?" "Yes, Your Honor, I know it sounds." Before Sarah could finish, a voice exploded from across the courtroom. "Objection!" The defense attorney practically flew out of his seat, his face reddening with indignation. "Your Honor, this is absolutely absurd. A dog in the courtroom. During testimony. This is a court of law, not a petting zoo. This is prejudicial, it's manipulative, it's a circus." Strode toward the bench, his expensive Italian shoes clicking sharply against the floor, his movements aggressive and theatrical. He was in his element now, performing outrage for the jury that would soon be returning to their seats. "Your Honor, the prosecution is clearly trying to gain sympathy by bringing in an adorable animal. This is emotional manipulation of the worst kind. The jury will be influenced by the presence of a cute dog rather than focusing on the facts of the case. I move that this request be immediately, and furthermore I move that—" "Mr. Judge Harrison interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of decades on the bench. "I haven't made a decision yet, so perhaps you could save your theatrics until I've actually ruled on something." Sputtered but fell silent, though his face remained flushed with anger. Behind him, sat at the defense table, his earlier confidence wavering. He leaned forward, whispering urgently to his attorney, clearly disturbed by this unexpected development. Judge Harrison turned back to Sarah. "Ms., you understand this is completely unprecedented. I've never heard of such a request in any courtroom in Massachusetts, possibly in the entire country." "I understand that, Your Honor," Sarah replied, her voice stronger now, conviction building. "But Emma is also unprecedented. We're asking a 3-year-old to testify about witnessing brutal violence against her mother. We've spent 20 minutes this morning watching her suffer in silence, unable to communicate despite our best efforts. But the moment this dog entered the room, she responded. She moved. She engaged. For the first time today, she showed signs of life." Officer, who had been standing quietly near the door with Justice, cleared his throat. "Your Honor, if I may speak." Judge Harrison nodded. "Go ahead, officer." Stepped forward slightly, his hand resting on Justice's head. "Your Honor, I've worked with Justice for 4 years. He's a trained police K-9 with an exemplary record. He's been in hundreds of high-stress situations and has never acted inappropriately. He's calm, obedient, and honestly, sir, he's one of the most gentle animals I've ever known, despite his training. If you're concerned about safety or disruption, I can personally guarantee Justice will cause neither." Judge Harrison looked at the dog, who was still sitting perfectly still beside Emma, allowing the little girl to lean against his side. Justice's intelligent amber eyes met the judge's gaze calmly, and Harrison could have sworn the dog understood the gravity of the moment. In the gallery, Maria stood up, unable to contain herself any longer. "Please," she said, her voice breaking, tears streaming down her face. "Please, Your Honor, my baby hasn't spoken in weeks. She has nightmares every night, she barely eats. She won't talk to anyone, but look at her now, look at her." Maria pointed at Emma, who was now sitting cross-legged on the floor beside Justice, her small hand resting on the dog's back, her face more peaceful than it had been in weeks. "That dog is helping her. Please don't take that away from her." The victim's advocate tried to get Maria to sit back down, but Judge Harrison held up his hand. "It's all right. Mrs., I understand your concern for your daughter." He paused, looking around the courtroom at the faces watching him. The jury, the court staff, the journalists, the lawyers, all waiting for his decision. Jumped back in, sensing he was losing ground. "Your Honor, there's simply no legal precedent for this. Show me one case, anywhere in American jurisprudence, where a dog was allowed to remain in the courtroom during witness testimony. One case." His voice dripped with sarcasm. "This is a courtroom, not a therapy session. If the child cannot testify under normal courtroom conditions, then perhaps she simply cannot testify. That's not the court's problem to solve, by turning these proceedings into a mockery of justice." "Mr." Judge Harrison said slowly, his voice dangerously quiet, "are you suggesting that I should deny a request that might help a 3-year-old victim find her voice, simply because it's never been done before? Are you really standing in my courtroom arguing that tradition is more important than the possibility of justice for your client's 3-year-old niece?" Backpedaled slightly. "Your Honor, I'm simply saying that rules exist for a reason, and—" "Rules exist to serve justice, mister, not to obstruct it," Judge Harrison interrupted. He turned to the court reporter. "Let the record show that I am fully aware this decision is unprecedented. Let it also show that I am fully aware I may be reversed on appeal. And let it show that I don't particularly care about either of those facts at this moment." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Officer stood a little, his hand tightening slightly on Justice's leash. Judge Harrison looked down at Emma, who had finally noticed all the commotion and was looking around with wide, uncertain eyes. When her gaze found the judge, Harrison smiled at her, a warm, grandfatherly smile that transformed his usually stern face. "Emma," he said gently, "do you like that dog?" Emma looked at Justice, then back at the judge. And then, in a voice so small it was barely audible, she whispered a single word that electrified the entire courtroom. "Yes." It was the first word she had spoken in that courtroom. The first word she had spoken to anyone outside her immediate family since the night of the attack. One simple word, but it carried the weight of breakthrough, of hope, of possibility. Judge Harrison nodded slowly. "Then justice stays." He banged his gavel once, the sound echoing through the stunned courtroom. "Officer, position yourself and your K-9 partner near the witness stand. Ms., you may proceed with your witness. Mr., your objection is noted for the record and overruled. If you'd like to file an appeal later, that's your prerogative, but right now, we're going to try something that's never been done before, because sometimes justice requires us to break the rules." Sank into his chair, momentarily defeated. His face had gone pale. He understood what this meant. The little girl who had been silent might now speak, and if she spoke, his freedom was over. Sarah felt tears of relief and gratitude threatening to spill, but she blinked them back. There was no time for emotion now. They had just been given an extraordinary opportunity, and she couldn't waste it. Officer led Justice to a spot near the witness stand, positioning the dog where Emma could see him easily. Justice settled down onto the floor, lying in a sphinx-like position, his head up and alert but his body relaxed and calm. Emma watched all of this from where she still sat on the floor. The child services worker gently helped her back into the witness chair, lifting her up into the oversized seat. Emma's pink sneakers dangled above the floor once again, but this time she wasn't staring at nothing. She was looking at Justice, and Justice was looking back at her with those steady, calm amber eyes that seemed to say, "You're safe. I'm right here." Judge Harrison addressed the jury, who were filing back into their seats, their faces showing everything from confusion to curiosity to deep emotion. "Ladies and of the jury, you've just witnessed something unusual. I want to be clear that the presence of Officer's K-9 partner is solely for the comfort of this young witness and should not be construed as any kind of statement about the case itself. The dog is simply here as a calming presence for a traumatized child. Do you all understand?" 12 heads nodded. Several jurors were wiping their eyes. Sarah approached the witness stand once more, but this time everything felt different. The air felt charged with possibility rather than defeat. Emma was looking at her, really looking at her, not through her. "Emma," Sarah said softly, "is it okay if I ask you some questions now?" Emma looked at Justice. Justice's tail gave one slow wag, and Emma looked back at Sarah and nodded. It was time to try again. The courtroom had never been so silent. Every person in that space, from the 12 jurors to the court reporter to the journalists scribbling in their notepads, seemed to be holding their breath. Sarah stood before little Emma, knowing that this was the moment that would define not just this case, but possibly her entire career. Everything hinged on whether this 3-year-old child, with a police dog as her anchor to safety, could finally tell the truth about the horror she had witnessed. Sarah's voice was soft, gentle, like she was speaking to her own child at bedtime. "Emma, honey, I'm going to ask you some questions, and you can answer them however you feel comfortable. You can talk, or you can nod, or you can point. There's no wrong way to answer, okay?" Emma's eyes flickered from Sarah to Justice, who lay perfectly still near the witness stand, his amber eyes fixed on the little girl with unwavering attention. Emma's small hand clutched Mr. Button's, her teddy bear, but her grip wasn't as desperate as it had been earlier. She nodded just barely, but it was enough. "Good girl," Sarah encouraged. "Emma, do you know why you're here today?" Emma's face clouded with confusion. She was 3 years old. Concepts like courtrooms and testimony and legal proceedings were far beyond her comprehension. Sarah realized immediately she needed to simplify everything, to speak in Emma's language. "Let me ask it a different way, sweetie. Do you remember the night when something bad happened at your house, when Mommy got hurt?" The change in Emma was instantaneous and heartbreaking. Her entire body tensed. Her eyes went wide with remembered fear. Her breathing quickened. She began to retreat back into that shell of silence, and Sarah could feel the moment slipping away. But then Justice did something extraordinary. The German Shepherd, trained to remain still during operations, shifted slightly and let out a soft whine, not a distressed sound but a gentle, comforting one. It was the kind of sound a mother dog makes to her puppies, a sound that said, "I'm here. You're not alone." Emma's eyes shot to Justice, and the dog's tail wagged once, twice, 3 times. That simple gesture of canine reassurance seemed to pull Emma back from the edge of her fear. She took a shaky breath and looked back at Sarah. "I know it's scary to think about," Sarah continued, her own voice thick with emotion. "But your mommy is right here." She gestured to the gallery where Maria sat, tears streaming down her face, "and she's safe now. And Justice is here too. Nobody is going to hurt you, Emma, I promise." Emma looked at her mother. Maria managed a trembling smile and nodded encouragingly at her daughter. Then Emma looked back at Sarah and gave the tiniest nod. Yes, she remembered that night. Sarah's heart was racing, but she kept her voice calm and steady. "Emma, can you tell us what happened that night? Can you tell us who hurt Mommy?" This was it. This was the question that the entire case depended on. Leaned forward at the defense table, ready to object at the slightest hint of leading the witness. Had gone very still, his hands clenched into fists on the table before him. The jury collectively leaned forward. Judge Harrison's knuckles were white as he gripped his gavel. Emma's mouth opened, then closed. Her lower lip began to tremble. She looked down at Mr. Buttons, then at Justice, then at her mother, then at Sarah. The little girl was trying so hard to be brave, trying so hard to find the words, but the trauma was like a physical weight pressing down on her small shoulders. Sarah waited, every fiber of her being wanting to push, to prompt, to help, but knowing she couldn't. Leading a witness, especially a child witness, would destroy the credibility of any testimony. Emma had to do this on her own. Seconds ticked by, 10 seconds, 20, 30. The silence stretched like taffy, pulling and until Sarah thought it might snap and break everything. And then Emma raised her small arm, her tiny finger extended, shaking but pointing with unmistakable certainty. But she wasn't pointing at the defense table where sat. She wasn't pointing at her mother or at Sarah or at anyone in the courtroom. She was pointing directly at Justice. Confusion rippled through the courtroom like a wave. Murmurs began to spread. What was she doing? Why was she pointing at the dog? Started to rise from his seat, preparing to argue that the child was clearly too confused to provide reliable testimony. But before anyone could speak, before the moment could dissolve into chaos, Emma's small voice rang out clear and strong, stronger than anyone had heard from her all day. 2 words. Just 2 simple words that she said with absolute, heartbreaking certainty. Hurt her. The courtroom seemed to freeze. Time itself stopped. Emma's finger still pointed at Justice, and those 2 words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Sarah's mind raced, trying to understand. Emma, sweetie, Justice didn't hurt anyone. But Emma shook her head violently, her pigtails swinging. Hurt her, she said again, louder this time, more insistent. Her small face was scrunched up with the effort of making the adults understand. Hurt her. And then, as if frustrated that no one was comprehending what she was trying so desperately to communicate, Emma did something that made everything suddenly, horrifyingly crystal clear. She pulled her small hands into fists and brought them together in a violent striking motion, her little arms swinging with as much force as a 3-year-old could muster. She made the motion again and again, punch, 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 demonstrating aggression, violence, attack. Then she pointed at Justice again and repeated, her voice now carrying the full weight of her trauma. Uncle, like dog, hurt her, like dog hurt, bad dog hurt. In that single, shattering moment, everyone in the courtroom understood. Emma wasn't saying Justice had hurt anyone. She was using Justice as a reference point, as a symbol of power and aggression. In her 3-year-old mind, with her limited vocabulary and understanding of the world, she had seen police dogs on television or in her neighborhood, seen them apprehending suspects, taking down criminals with overwhelming force. To her, that's what police dogs did. They attacked with terrible, frightening power. And that's what her uncle had done to her mother. He had attacked like a police dog attacks, viciously, brutally, with overwhelming violence. Emma had witnessed her uncle transform into something terrifying and aggressive, and the only way her young mind could articulate what she'd seen was to compare it to the most powerful, aggressive thing she knew, a police dog in attack mode. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. Officer's jaw had dropped open, and he felt chills run down his entire body as he understood what his partner had unknowingly become, a translator for unspeakable trauma. Justice himself seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, his ears flattening slightly, his expression almost sorrowful. In the gallery, Maria let out a sound between a sob and a gasp, finally understanding what her daughter had been trying to say all along, finally understanding the burden this tiny child had been carrying. Emma wasn't finished. With tears now streaming down her own small cheeks, she pointed at her mother and made the striking motion again. Uncle, hurt mommy, like dog, attack, attack. She was crying now, the words coming faster, breaking through the dam of silence that had held them back. Blood, mommy crying, mommy fall down, uncle bad, like bad dog hurt her. The courtroom erupted. Several jurors were openly weeping. A journalist in the back row had stopped writing entirely, just staring with her hand over her mouth. The bailiff, tough as nails Tom, had to turn away to compose himself. The defense attorney remained frozen in his half-standing position, his earlier objection dying on his lips. He slowly sank back into his chair, his face ashen. Even he, a man who had made a career of defending guilty people, couldn't bring himself to attack this testimony. Had gone white as a sheet. His hands trembled on the table. His eyes were wide with the realization that his 3-year-old niece, the child he had assumed was too young to remember, too young to articulate, too young to matter, had just destroyed his defense with 2 simple words and a devastating comparison. Judge Harrison had to use his gavel to restore order, but even he had tears in his eyes. "Order," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Order in the court." Sarah knew she had to move quickly while Emma was still able to communicate. "Emma, sweetheart, you're being so brave. Can you answer a few more questions for me?" Emma nodded, wiping her nose with the back of her hand, her eyes still fixed on justice as if the dog were her lifeline to courage. "When Uncle hurt Mommy like the dog attacks, where were you?" "Behind couch," Emma whispered, hiding. "Did Uncle see you?" "No, I quiet, very quiet." "And after Uncle hurt Mommy, what happened?" "He leave, I go to Mommy crying, so much blood." Emma's voice broke on the last word. "I scared, I call Mama, but she no wake up good." Sarah had to pause to collect herself. "You were very brave, Emma. You tried to help your mommy." Emma nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. But she had done it. She had. She had told the truth in the only way her 3-year-old mind and vocabulary could express it. And that truth was about to change everything. The aftermath of Emma's testimony felt like the moment after lightning strikes, that suspended instant where the world holds its breath before the thunder arrives. Sarah stood frozen at the witness stand, her legal pad clutched in trembling hands, watching as 3-year-old Emma wiped tears from her cheeks with small, shaking fists. The little girl had just accomplished what seemed impossible 20 minutes ago. She had found her voice, and in doing so, she had detonated a bomb in the middle of defense. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, struggling to maintain his judicial composure. In 30 years on the bench, he had seen thousands of witnesses testify, hardened criminals, corrupt executives, grieving family members. But nothing had prepared him for the raw, devastating power of a traumatized toddler finally speaking her truth. "Ms.," he said, his voice hoarse, "do you have any further questions for this witness?" Sarah wanted to ask more, wanted to nail down every detail, but one look at Emma's exhausted face told her that pushing further would be cruel. The child had given everything she had. "No, Your Honor. The prosecution has no further questions at this time." All eyes turned to the defense attorney, who sat at his table looking like a man who had just watched his entire strategy crumble into dust. Was known throughout Massachusetts as a shark in the courtroom, a lawyer who could find weaknesses in any testimony, who could create reasonable doubt from thin air. But as he looked at Emma, still sitting in that oversized witness chair with tears staining her butterfly dress, even knew there was no cross-examination that wouldn't make him look like a monster. "Mr. Judge," Harrison prompted, "do you wish to cross-examine this witness?" Stood slowly, his expensive suit somehow looking rumpled despite its perfect pressing. He glanced at, whose face had drained of all color, whose hands were clenched so tightly on the defense table that his knuckles had turned white. Shook his head almost imperceptibly, a signal understood immediately. "Don't make this worse." "No, Your Honor," said quietly, the fight gone from his voice. "The defense has no questions for this witness." A collective exhale swept through the courtroom. Several jurors visibly relaxed, clearly relieved they wouldn't have to watch a defense attorney grill a 3-year-old about her trauma. The journalists in the back row were already typing furiously on their phones and laptops, knowing they had just witnessed something that would make national headlines. "Very well," Judge Harrison said gently. He looked down at Emma with grandfatherly kindness. "Emma, you've been very brave today. Thank you for talking to us. You can step down now." The child services worker, Williams, approached the witness stand to help Emma down, but the little girl had one more thing to do. Before stepping down, Emma turned to look at Justice, who had remained in his sphinx-like position throughout the entire testimony, a steady anchor of calm in the storm of emotion. Emma slid off the chair and walked directly to the German Shepherd, wrapping her small arms around his thick neck in a hug that made even the most cynical people in that courtroom wipe their eyes. "Good dog," Emma whispered into Justice's fur. "Good dog helped me." Officer, standing nearby, felt his vision blur with tears. He had worked with Justice for 4 years, had seen his partner save lives and catch criminals, but this moment, this tiny child thanking his dog for giving her courage, was something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Justice, as if understanding the significance of the moment, gently licked Emma's cheek, his tail wagging slowly. The courtroom watched in reverent silence as Williams gently guided Emma back to her mother in the gallery. Maria stood, her good arm outstretched, her face a mask of tears and relief and love. When Emma reached her, Maria scooped her daughter up despite her injured arm, holding her so tightly it seemed she might never let go. Me, Maria whispered into Emma's hair. "My love, my brave one." Around them, people in the gallery were crying openly. A woman too rose back. A stranger who had come to observe the trial reached forward and squeezed Maria's shoulder. "Your daughter is a hero," she whispered. Maria could only nod, too overwhelmed to speak. But while the gallery processed the emotional impact of what had just occurred, the legal implications were already cascading through the courtroom like dominoes falling in sequence. Sarah returned to the prosecution table where her assistant was frantically pulling up files on his laptop. "We've got her," whispered, his voice trembling with excitement and disbelief. "Her testimony corroborates everything. The hospital timeline, the injuries, even the 911 call where neighbors reported hearing a child screaming." Sarah nodded, her mind already 3 steps ahead. Emma's testimony had been devastating, but they needed to strike while the iron was hot. "Call doctor," she instructed. "We need expert testimony to explain why Emma's associative comparison is actually highly credible for her age and trauma level." Within minutes, Doctor, the child psychologist who had been observing from the front row, was called to the stand. Doctor was in her 50s, with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a professional bun and glasses that gave her an air of academic authority. She had in hundreds of cases involving child witnesses, but even she seemed moved by what she had just witnessed. After being sworn in, Doctor settled into the witness chair that Emma had just vacated, and Sarah began her questioning. "Doctor, you observed Emma's testimony. In your professional opinion as a child psychologist specializing in trauma, how would you characterize what we just witnessed?" Doctor leaned forward, her voice clear and authoritative. What Emma demonstrated was actually a remarkably sophisticated form of communication for a 3-year-old who has experienced severe trauma. Children of that age typically have a vocabulary of about 1,000 words, but their ability to express complex emotional experiences is extremely limited. What Emma did, using a reference point she understood, the concept of an attacking police dog, to describe violence she witnessed, shows both the depth of her memory and her cognitive attempt to process and communicate trauma. Sarah nodded. "So you're saying her comparison was credible?" "More than credible," Doctor responded firmly. "It was brilliant in a heartbreaking way. Emma's brain was searching for a framework to explain something horrific that she witnessed. Police dogs represent power, force, and aggression in a child's understanding of the world. By comparing her uncle's attack on her mother to how an attack dog operates, she was essentially saying, he attacked with overwhelming, terrifying force. That's exactly how young children communicate traumatic events, through metaphor, through comparison to things they can conceptualize." shifted uncomfortably in his seat but didn't object. He knew that objecting now would only draw more attention to testimony that was already damaging his client beyond repair. "Doctor," Sarah continued, "in your professional experience, could a 3-year-old fabricate or be coached to give the kind of testimony we just heard?" "Absolutely not," Doctor stated unequivocally. "The emotional authenticity, the specific details like hiding behind the couch, the sensory memories like seeing blood, the genuine distress in her voice, these cannot be manufactured. Additionally, the spontaneous way she used justice as a reference point showed real-time cognitive processing. That's not something that can be coached or scripted. Emma was accessing genuine traumatic memory and finding a way to communicate it." The jury was transfixed. Juror number 7, the mother of 3 who had been crying earlier, was nodding along with every word Doctor spoke. Juror number 3, retired teacher James Cooper, was taking careful notes. They weren't just hearing expert testimony. They were hearing validation of what their hearts had already told them. That little girl was telling the truth. Sarah had a few more questions, but the foundation was solid. Doctor had just transformed Emma's emotional testimony into legally credible evidence. When the prosecutor finally said, "No further questions," she could see the resignation in his face. The defense attorney's cross-examination was brief and half-hearted. "Doctor, isn't it possible that a 3-year-old could be confused about what she saw?" "Anything is possible," Doctor replied calmly, "but the specificity and consistency of Emma's testimony, combined with her emotional state and the physical evidence of her mother's injuries, makes confusion highly unlikely. Emma knew exactly what she saw." Tried a few more questions but gained no ground. When he finally sat down, everyone in that courtroom knew the case had fundamentally shifted. Judge Harrison called for a brief recess, and during those 15 minutes, the entire atmosphere of the trial transformed. In the hallway, defense attorney pulled into a private conference room. What was said behind that closed door remained confidential, but those who saw emerge said he looked like a man staring into the abyss of his own future, a future that now almost certainly included prison bars. Meanwhile, Sarah stood in the women's restroom, gripping the sink and trying to stop shaking. She had won cases before, big cases, important cases, but this felt different. This felt like she had just helped give voice to the voiceless, helped deliver justice for someone who couldn't fight for herself. When court resumed, stood with visible reluctance. "Your Honor, the defense requests a recess until tomorrow morning to consult with our client about potential next steps." Everyone in that courtroom knew what potential next steps meant. Plea deal. The 2 words that men understood his trial was over before it really began. Judge Harrison granted the request, and as the courtroom emptied, officer gathered Justice's leash, preparing to leave. But before they could exit, dozens of people approached, jurors, court staff, even strangers from the gallery, wanting to pet Justice, to thank him, to acknowledge what this remarkable dog had done. Justice accepted the attention with his usual calm dignity, his tail wagging gently, seemingly unaware that he had just become the most important witness in Springfield County legal history. And in the corner of the courtroom, Emma slept in her mother's arms, exhausted from her ordeal but finally safe. The nightmare was ending. Justice, both the dog and the concept, was finally within reach. The Springfield County Courthouse buzzed with an energy it hadn't felt in years. By the time the evening news aired that Tuesday night, Emma's testimony had become the lead story on every local channel. Footage of officer and Justice walking into the courthouse played on loop, alongside interviews with legal experts who called the case groundbreaking and precedent-setting. Social media exploded with the hashtag #JusticeForEmma, which trended nationally within hours. The image of a 3-year-old girl finding her voice through a police dog captured hearts across the country. But while the public celebrated, real work was happening behind closed doors. In a small conference room on the 3rd floor of the courthouse, sat across from his client, and the conversation was not going well. "You need to take the plea deal," said bluntly, his usual courtroom polish abandoned. He had spread police reports, medical records, and his own notes across the table, a mountain of evidence that had suddenly become insurmountable. "Sarah is offering 8 years with possibility of parole in 6. That's generous. That's merciful, considering what the jury just heard." His hands trembled as he gripped his coffee cup. 8 years, 8 years of my life, for what? A family argument that got out of hand. Resisted the urge to slam his fist on the table. A family argument. You put your sister in the hospital for 2 weeks. You fractured her ribs, broke her arm, gave her a concussion that the doctors said could have killed her. And now your 3-year-old niece just, in the most devastating testimony I've ever witnessed, that you attacked her mother like a vicious dog. Do you understand what's going to happen if we continue this trial? Looked away, his jaw clenched. Continued, his voice low and urgent. That jury is going to convict you. Not maybe will. I've been doing this for 23 years, and I've never seen a jury more sympathetic to a victim or more hostile to a defendant. And when they convict you, the judge isn't going to show mercy. He's going to throw the book at you. We're talking 12 to 15 years minimum, possibly 20. Judge Harrison just broke precedent to allow a dog in his courtroom to help that little girl testify. Do you think he's going to be lenient when it comes to sentencing? The truth of his words hung in the air like smoke. His face had gone pale, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. He had walked into that courtroom confident, almost cocky, certain that a 3-year-old couldn't hurt him. Now he understood how wrong he had been. Meanwhile, in the district attorney's office down the hall, Sarah was having a very different conversation. Her boss, District Attorney James, had called an impromptu meeting with the entire prosecution team, and the mood was jubilant. "Sarah, what you pulled off today was nothing short of miraculous," said, leaning back in his leather chair with a rare smile. "I've already fielded calls from the Boston Globe, the New York Times, and CNN. This case is going national, maybe international. But more importantly, you gave that little girl justice. That's what matters." Sarah nodded, but her expression remained serious. "We haven't won yet, sir. Requested a recess to discuss options, which means they're considering a plea. But until signs on the dotted line, we can't celebrate." Her assistant jumped in excitedly. "But even if he doesn't take the plea, we've got him. Emma's testimony was airtight. Doctors' expert analysis sealed it. The jury is on our side. We can't lose." "We can always lose," Sarah corrected gently. "Never underestimate what a desperate defense attorney can do. Is down but not out. He might try to argue that Emma was coached, that the dog's presence prejudiced the jury, that the testimony was too emotionally manipulative. We need to be prepared for anything." But Sarah's caution was unnecessary. At 4:47 p.m. that afternoon, sent word that would accept the plea agreement. 8 years in state prison for aggravated assault and domestic violence, with the possibility of parole after 6 years if he completed anger management and violence prevention programs. It wasn't the maximum sentence, but it was justice. When Sarah received the message, she closed her eyes and exhaled a breath she felt like she'd been holding all day. They had done it. Emma's voice, small and scared but ultimately powerful, had brought down her abuser. The formal plea hearing was scheduled for the next morning. Judge Harrison's courtroom was packed again, but this time the atmosphere was different. There was no tension, no uncertainty, just the cold, administrative process of justice being served. Stood before the judge in his orange jumpsuit, his hands shackled, looking nothing like the confident man who had sat at the defense table just 24 hours earlier. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes downcast. When Judge Harrison asked if he understood the plea agreement, his voice was barely audible. "Yes, Your Honor." "And do you admit, mister, that on the night of December 3rd you did assault your sister Maria, causing her severe bodily harm?" A long pause, then quietly, "Yes, Your Honor." In the gallery, Maria sat holding Emma, who was blissfully unaware of the significance of the moment, playing with a small toy puppy that Officer had given her the day before. Maria's eyes were dry. She had cried all her tears. Now she felt only relief. Her brother would go to prison. Her daughter was safe. They could finally begin to heal. Judge Harrison's voice was stern as he delivered his statement. "Mister, I want you to understand something. The only reason you're receiving this plea agreement is because the prosecution is showing you mercy that you did not show your sister. That 3-year-old child in this courtroom had more courage in her testimony yesterday than you've shown in your entire life. You attacked a woman who trusted you in front of her young daughter, and you traumatized that child in ways that may take years to heal. I'm accepting this plea deal, but know this. If you violate your parole, if you come anywhere near Maria or Emma, if you so much as send them a letter, I will personally see to it that you serve every remaining day of your sentence behind bars. Do you understand me?" "Yes, Your Honor," whispered. 8 years in state prison, with credit for time served, mandatory anger management and domestic violence counseling, permanent restraining order against the victims. This court is adjourned. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the courtroom like a period at the end of a long, painful sentence. As guards led away, he glanced once at his sister. Maria stared back at him with eyes that held no forgiveness, only closure. Emma looked up from her toy puppy just as her uncle was taken through the side door. She didn't say anything, didn't cry, just watched him disappear. In her 3-year-old mind, the bad man was going away. That was enough. The courtroom erupted in applause, unprecedented in Judge Harrison's courtroom, but he made no move to stop it. Sarah was immediately surrounded by well-wishers, other attorneys, advocates, and reporters, but she pushed through them all to reach Maria and Emma. "It's over," Sarah said simply, kneeling beside Emma's chair. "He's going away for a long time." Maria's voice broke as she responded, "Thank you. Thank you for believing us, for believing her." Emma looked at Sarah with her big brown eyes and asked, "Where Justice?" Sarah smiled. "Justice, the dog, had to go back to work, sweetie, but I bet Officer would bring him to visit you sometime if you'd like that." Emma's face lit up with the first genuine smile Sarah had seen from her. "Yes, I want to see Justice. He my friend." The story spread like wildfire. By that evening, major news networks were running segments on the case. Legal scholars debated the implications on talk shows. Child advocacy groups praised the precedent. The American Kennel Club issued a statement celebrating Justice's role. Officer's phone rang non-stop with interview requests. But perhaps the most significant call came from the Massachusetts Attorney General's office. They wanted to meet with Sarah about implementing a statewide program allowing trained facility dogs in courtrooms for child witnesses and vulnerable victims. Emma's case, the case of the little girl who pointed at a police dog and said 2 words, was about to change the justice system across the entire state, potentially across the country. 3 days after was taken to state prison to begin his sentence, the Springfield District Attorney's Office held a press conference. Sarah stood at the podium with Maria and Emma beside her, an Officer and Justice sitting nearby. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. But Sarah's statement was brief and powerful. "This case proved something important," she said, her voice carrying across the crowded room. "Justice doesn't always look the way we expect it to. Sometimes it comes from the courage of a 3-year-old girl. Sometimes it's helped by a 4-legged partner who didn't even know he was making history. Emma found her voice when we gave her the tools she needed to speak. Our justice system should always be willing to adapt, to break precedent when necessary, to put victims first. That's what happened here. And that's what should happen everywhere." Emma, sitting on her mother's lap, waved at Justice. The dog's tail wagged, and for just a moment, the chaos of the press conference faded away. It was just a little girl and a dog who had helped her be brave. Justice had been served, in every sense of the word, 5 years had passed since that February morning when a 3-year-old girl pointed at a police dog and spoke 2 words that changed everything. The Springfield County Courthouse looked the same from the outside. Same imposing granite columns, same wide marble steps, same American flag snapping in the Massachusetts wind. But inside, everything was different. In Courtroom 4B, now known informally as Justice's Courtroom, a yellow Labrador retriever named Hope lay calmly beside a witness stand where a 7-year-old boy was testifying about abuse he had suffered. The child's hand occasionally reached down to touch Hope's soft fur, and each time he did, his voice grew steadier, stronger. In the gallery, his mother wept with relief. Her son was finally speaking, finally healing. This scene had played out 73 times over the past 5 years. 73 child witnesses, ranging in age from 3 to 12, had found their voices with the help of trained courthouse facility dogs. The program that began with Justice had expanded across Massachusetts, then rippled outward to Connecticut, Ireland, New York, and beyond. Emma's case had become a touchstone in family law, cited in legal briefs, taught in law schools, discussed in psychology courses. But the real story wasn't in the legal precedents or the academic papers. It was in the lives that had been changed, rebuilt, and healed. Emma was now 8 years old, a bright third grader with the same curly brown hair but a smile that came easily these days. She lived with her mother Maria in a cozy apartment across town from where the attack had happened. They'd moved 6 months after the trial, needing a fresh start, a place without bad memories soaked into the walls. Emma was in therapy, and while she still had occasional nightmares, they were becoming less frequent. She was a normal kid who loved art class, hated math homework, and had a best friend named Sophie who she talked about constantly. And she had never forgotten Justice. Every 3 months, Officer brought Justice to visit Emma. They'd meet at a local park, and Emma would throw tennis balls that Justice would retrieve with enthusiasm that never seemed to diminish despite his advancing age. Now 9 years old, Justice had retired from active police duty the previous year, his body slowing down but his spirit still strong. He lived with full time now, spending his days as a certified therapy dog, visiting schools, hospitals, and courthouses. On this particular Saturday morning in October, pulled into the parking lot of Riverside Park where Maria and Emma were waiting on their usual bench. Emma spotted Justice before the car even stopped, jumping up and waving frantically. "Justice! Justice!" The old German shepherd's tail wagged with genuine joy as opened the back door. Justice might have been slower these days, might have a bit of gray around his muzzle, but when he saw Emma, he bounded toward her with puppyish enthusiasm. Emma wrapped her arms around his neck in that same tight hug she'd given him in the courtroom 5 years ago. "I missed you, Justice," Emma said into his fur. "I got an A on my book report. Mama said you'd be proud of me." Smiled, settling onto the bench beside Maria. "How's she doing? Really doing?" Maria's eyes followed her daughter as Emma and Justice walked toward the open field, the girl chattering away while the dog listened attentively. "She's good, really good. Doctor says Emma's resilience is remarkable. The nightmares are down to maybe once a month now. She's made friends at school. She talks about becoming a veterinarian when she grows up because she wants to help dogs like Justice." Felt his throat tighten with emotion. "That's wonderful, Maria, really wonderful." Maria said, turning to face him, her voice serious, "I never got to properly thank you. Not really. You and Justice, you saved us. Not just from drowning in that trauma. Emma had locked herself away and Justice gave her the key to come back. I think about that every single day." "Justice did the real work," said modestly, watching his partner play gently with Emma. "I was just the guy holding the leash." Maria shook her head. "No, you trusted your instincts. You stayed when you could have left. You let that connection happen. That was you." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching Emma show Justice how she could do a cartwheel, something she'd been too afraid to try a year ago. The dog barked encouragingly, tail wagging. Did you hear his parole was last month? Maria said quietly. Nodded. I heard. He'll serve at least 2 more years before he can reapply. Good, Maria said firmly. There was no anger in her voice, just finality. Emma asks about him sometimes. She remembers him, but it's distant like a bad dream. Her therapist says that's healthy. She's processing it without being consumed by it. Glanced at Maria, noticing how different she looked from that broken woman in the courtroom gallery 5 years ago. She held herself now, her eyes brighter, her smile genuine. She had returned to school, was now a licensed practical nurse working at Springfield General Hospital. Ironically, the same hospital where she'd been treated after the attack. She had turned her trauma into purpose. And you asked, how are you doing? Maria considered the question. I'm good. It took a long time, a lot of therapy, a lot of hard days, but I'm good. I'm strong. And I made sure Emma saw that we could survive this, that we could thrive. That's important. Emma came running back, breathless and laughing, Justice trotting beside her. Mama, can Justice come to my birthday party next month, please? Sophie really wants to meet him. Maria laughed. I don't know, sweetie, we'll have to ask Officer. Already planning on it, interrupted with a grin. Wouldn't miss it. Justice loves birthday cake. Emma's squeal of delight could probably be heard across the park. Meanwhile, across town in the Springfield District Attorney's office, Sarah was training a new prosecutor on the courthouse facility dog program. Sarah had been promoted to senior assistant district attorney, and one of her primary responsibilities was overseeing the program that had grown from Emma's case. The dogs aren't just props, Sarah explained to the young attorney, pulling up case files on her computer. They're therapeutic tools that help traumatized witnesses access their ability to communicate. We've seen conviction rates in child abuse cases increase by 43% since implementing the program. But more importantly, we've seen 73 children find their voices when they thought they'd lost them forever. The young attorney, fresh out of law school and eager to make a difference, leaned forward intently. What's the most important thing to remember when working with a child witness and a facility dog? Sarah thought back to that day 5 years ago, to Emma's small finger pointing at Justice, to those 2 devastating words. Remember that justice doesn't always follow the script we write. Sometimes we have to break the rules, trust our instincts, and put the victim first. The law is supposed to serve people, not the other way around. That's what Judge Harrison taught me that day. Judge Robert Harrison had retired the previous year at age 68, but his legacy lived on in every courtroom where a facility dog lay beside a frightened witness. At his retirement dinner, Harrison had given a speech that brought tears to every eye in the room. In 32 years on the bench, he'd said, I made thousands of rulings, but the one I'm most proud of was the day I said yes to a police dog staying in my courtroom to help a little girl be brave. That decision taught me that sometimes the most important thing a judge can do is remember that behind every case number is a human being who deserves compassion. The ripple effects continued to spread. Law school had added a case study on V to their curriculum. The American Bar Association published guidelines for courthouse facility dog programs. Child advocacy groups across the country cited Emma's case as a turning point in how the justice system treats young victims. Several states passed legislation officially authorizing facility dogs in courtrooms, removing the need for judges to make unprecedented decisions like Harrison had. Officer had received commendations from the mayor, the police chief, and the governor, but his favorite recognition came in the form of crayon drawings that Emma made for him and Justice, colorful pictures that decorated his locker at the police station, showing a little girl holding hands with a big dog under a smiling sun. Justice himself had become something of a celebrity. His story had been featured in People magazine, on Good Morning America, and in a children's book titled The Dog Who Helped Me Be Brave, written by a local author and illustrated with beautiful watercolors. A portion of the proceeds went to fund therapy dog training programs. As the sun began to set on that October evening and Justice prepared to leave the park, Emma gave Justice one final hug, pressing her face against his fur. "Thank you for always being my friend, Justice," she whispered. "You saved me." Justice licked her face, his tail wagging, and if dogs could smile, he was definitely smiling. Watched Maria and Emma walk hand in hand back to their car, their laughter carrying on the autumn breeze. He looked down at Justice, who was watching the pair with what could only describe as contentment. "You did good, buddy," said, scratching behind Justice's ears. "You did real good." That night, Emma slept peacefully in her bed, her room decorated with drawings of dogs and dreams of becoming a veterinarian. In her dreams, she wasn't hiding behind a couch or watching her mother get hurt. She was running through fields with Justice, both of them free and happy and safe. Maria sat in her living room, sipping tea and looking at the photo on her mantel, a picture from the park showing Emma laughing while hugging Justice. Beside it was another photo from the day after the trial, showing Emma receiving a certificate of bravery from the district attorney's office. Maria had framed both pictures together as a reminder. This is where we were, and this is who we became. And somewhere in the Massachusetts correctional system, lay in his cell, counting down the days until he could apply for parole again. He thought often about that day in court, about his niece's testimony, about the dog that had somehow given her the courage to speak. He had learned, too late, that sometimes the smallest voices carry the most devastating truths. Justice, both the dog and the concept, had prevailed. And in courtrooms across America, other children were finding their voices, one paw at a time, one brave word at a time. Emma had started something beautiful. She had shown the world that courage comes in all sizes, that healing is possible, and that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are the ones with 4 legs and a wagging tail. The legacy of 2 words hurt her lived on in every child who would never have to face their trauma alone, in every facility dog who would provide comfort, in every prosecutor who would fight for the voiceless, in every judge who would choose compassion over precedent. Justice had been served, and hope had won.